Miss Trisha is not here yet, unfortunately, but she should be coming soon.
The thing is, I'm running in to check whether my husband's thing is connected.
Okay.
So Prabha, can you do the prelims? Say hello to everybody.
Yes, I think that would be a good idea.
Okay.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Prabhakaran Nair, co-founder of the History for Nation Building Forum. May I welcome all of you to our forum, Managing Ethnic and Religious Identities in a Multicultural Setting, the Malaysian Narrative. The forum is organized by the History for Nation Building Forum in collaboration with Gerakbudaya. The History for Nation Building Forum was formed to explore links between history and nation building in terms of the positive and creative use of history to promote greater unity in our country. We are uncomfortably aware that we have arrived at 2020, but nowhere close to the vision that we had hoped for all these years. The webinar today will focus on the direction of change in a nation reeling from political, economic, and social uncertainties. Before I introduce the speakers, allow me to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here on a precious weekend to deliberate on crucial challenges facing our nation in these critical times. We have with us a panel of distinguished speakers, most of whom have been activists for many years in the cause of creating a better Malaysia for all of us. First and foremost, we have here with us Dr. Chandra Muzaffar, who has spent the past 5 decades writing and speaking about politics and ethnic relations as part of his commitment to social reform in Malaysia. After Chandra, we have Professor Emerita Bazir Jahan Karim, an anthropologist who is currently involved with NGO activities related to conservation, heritage, and gender. Her publications on women and gender cover issues of poverty and economic globalization, migration, ethnicity, and empowerment. Professor Said Farid Alatas lectures in sociology at the National University of Singapore, and his areas of interest include religion and reform, intra and interreligious dialogue, and the study of Orientalism. Judge David Alfred, our 4th speaker, is a lawyer who rose to become High Court Judge in the Republic of Fiji from 2015 to 2019. He brings to the forum his deep knowledge and keen passion for history. Ms. Trisha Yo, our 4th and last speaker, is CEO of the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, or IDEAS. She is also visiting research fellow at the ICS Yusof Ishak Institute, Singapore. Having introduced the speakers, may I now hand the session over to the moderator, Dr. Halima Muhammad Said, co-founder of the History for Nation Building Forum. Thank you very much.
Oh, one moment.
Do I have to repeat that?
Yes.
Right. Good afternoon, viewers and speakers. I'm Halima, your moderator for today. And the discussion today is managing ethnic and religious identities in a multicultural setting, the Malaysian narrative. Now, just to give you an idea of the format for this afternoon's discussion. Now, each speaker will be given 20 minutes to present your paper. 2 minutes before time is up, you will hear a little bell, right? Now, a 3 to 4 minute Q&A will follow each speaker's presentation. So viewers are invited to type in their question in the comment section on Gerakbudaya's live streaming on Facebook. But please be brief. Now make sure that your question is pointed and brief. Now, owing to time constraints, speakers may not be able to answer all your questions, but be assured that we'll keep a record of the questions. Right, as moderator, I will keep my comments, if any, very brief to allow for more interaction between viewers and speakers in the Q&A. Right, now, may I now invite the first speaker, Dr. Chandra Muzaffar, to give his paper on the question of national identity and integration. Dr. Chandra.
Thank you, Dr. Halima. Friends, Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers for this very kind invitation. My presentation will revolve around two questions. Number one, what are the forces and factors which shape perceptions of identity in a society like ours? And number two, how would one manage different perceptions of identity in a society like ours in order to achieve a certain degree of inter-ethnic harmony and peace in Malaysia? Now, the first question. What shapes perceptions of identity in a country like Malaysia? I would like to concentrate on two major forces. One, what shapes identity as far as the majority Malay society is concerned. And number two, what shapes identity as far as the minorities are concerned, especially the Chinese minority, which is the most significant minority in the country. Now, as far as the majority Malay community is concerned, perceptions of identity have been shaped largely by what I have often termed as the Malay position in the country. And what is this Malay position? It is its relationship with the land, its history, its identity. What is seen historically, widely accepted as a Malay land. It is linked to perceptions of some of the identity markers of this land: the language, Islam, its religion, the Sultanate, and other dimensions which have emerged as a result of this and the accommodation of the non-Malays, question of the Malay position. For instance, in relation to the economy, to the socioeconomic status of the community and the rest of it. It is also related to the Malay political position. It is related to the Malay view of the evolution of this land. Now, in the case of the non-Malays, their notion of identity is shaped by their perception of their rights, their perception of their link to education, to language, to culture, to the economy, to politics, as they'd evolved over the last few decades. Now, these are two major forces that have shaped notions of identity. Over the decades, you'll find that the impact of these two forces have manifested themselves in different spheres of life. Over time, certain dimensions have become very important. I just want to highlight two. In the case of the Malays, I think Islam and religion has become very important as an identity marker. And it shapes Malay notions of identity, the future of the community, its relationship with the others, and the rest of it. It is not just domestic elements which have shaped this notion of identity. It's also shaped by global factors because of Islam's role as a force in global politics and global society. And certain perceptions of the Muslim community, of what is seen as their losses, their defeats, their victimization in relation to Palestine, Kashmir, and so on and so forth. I think that has also shaped the notion of identity to a greater or less extent. In the case of the Chinese minority, over the decades, I think what is very, very significant is the relationship of the Chinese community to its language and education. That has become a powerful identity marker. And for the Chinese community, again, as in the case of the Malay majority, you find that there is an international dimension. This notion of community, education, language, and so on, it has been reinforced in recent decades by the ascendancy of China, which has shaped the Chinese notion of identity. And it's going to continue to impact upon the Chinese notion of identity apart from the domestic factors. Now, these are the forces which have shaped notions of identity on the side of the majority community and a significant minority community in Malaysia. How does one integrate these communities in a situation like this? Because if you look at both these forces at work, they are very, very powerful in terms of the impact. Islam has a very powerful impact upon the Malay community. And for the Chinese, language and education. How do you integrate? How do you bring communities together? I think the great advantage that we have is, in spite of everything, in spite of the chasm that exists between the communities as a result of the impact of these forces, we are fortunate that we have a constitution which addresses some of these issues, even if people are not aware of it. For instance, we look at the Malaysian Constitution. Right from the beginning, 1957, the Constitution takes into account both history and the contemporary realities. History, because of the position of the Malay language, of Islam, the Sultanates, that's history. It acknowledges this openly. At the same time, the Constitution says that there is a place for other languages and the practice of other religions. That's the contemporary setting. So you find that history has been taken into account, contemporary realities. There is a certain cognizance of how these forces have shaped our nation. So the Constitution is, to my mind, a positive factor. And this is one of the reasons why, unlike many other countries in the world, the Malaysian Constitution has withstood the test of time because of its relevance, of its ability to address challenges of this sort. And in the last 4 or 5 decades, we've had the Rukun Negara, which is linked to the Constitution because, the Constitution is part of the Rukun Negara. But more than that, the Rukun Negara links the Constitution and all these realities with ideals, which are very, very universal. Just society, unity, democracy, a liberal approach to traditions, progressive society. These are the goals, the aspirations of the Rukun Negara and the principles that guide them. So that is anchored us further in our ability to address these challenges emanating from our very complex identity situation. And as a result of both the Constitution of the Rukun Negara, we have willy-nilly certain shared values, principles, which we subscribe to, even if it's not very explicit, even if it is not openly manifested, but it's there. And we've also been able, I think, over time to live and let live a certain degree of accommodation that has been born. These are strengths. If you reflect on these strengths, there are, I think, certain other elements which emerge that need to be emphasized now more than ever. We have to understand that this approach we have adopted, not consciously, but an approach which has become part of our makeup as a nation. We have sought integration. We have, in a sense, put aside assimilation. That's not the approach we want. We have put aside a segregated approach, which is the other approach associated with certain societies. In our case, it's integration. Integration means certain shared core values and principles, but differences remain. The differences are celebrated. They're not regarded as a curse, as a bane upon our society. They are there. And we see those differences as part of the nation building process. At the same time, there are certain core values that this very diverse society subscribes to. And these would be in the form of institutions, perhaps parliament, perhaps the judiciary. These are some of the institutions, and other institutions like the monarchy, and also, I suppose, certain other processes and institutions, whether it's language, or, certain notion of sharing our cuisine, food, all these things would be part of that shared tradition. I think it is very important to emphasize this, that these are traditions that have evolved as a result of our evaluation, as a result of our evolution as a nation. Evolution is an important dimension of the identity process. It's not something that you can force upon anyone. You evolve an identity, and that we have to keep in mind. Nation building and its relationship to evolution. We also have to understand that if you look at evolution more deeply, there are many areas where we've evolved. We are not even aware of this. For instance, you take the Malay language. The Malay language is no longer the language of a community. It is a language of a multi-ethnic people. That's evolution. If you look at the Sultanate, for instance, the subjects are not just people from a particular community. The subjects are multi-ethnic. That's evolution. If you look at even the notion of citizenship in Malaysia, in the past, before Merdeka, you had the rulers and the subjects. That has become a citizenry, a multi-ethnic citizenry. That's evolution. So we have been evolving. And we have evolved in other areas too. I mean, even if you look at the economy, for instance, in 1970-71 NEP, one declares a commitment to eradicating poverty regardless of ethnicity. That's evolution from an earlier notion of poverty that is confined largely to our rural segment. We have been evolving. So I think we should look at it that way, evolution as part of the nation building process. And at the same time, I think we have to understand that this evolution must lead to something. And that something is common citizenship. That has to be our goal. Common citizenship is already the principle that is embodied in the Constitution. Article 8, other articles, they talk about common citizenship. Now here again, I would like to suggest that we have to look at citizenship from an evolutionary perspective. Citizenship very often is linked to rights in most societies. In our case too, citizenship is linked to ethnic rights and individual rights. But I think the time has come to articulate citizenship, not just in terms of rights, they will remain, we must also see citizenship in terms of responsibilities. Beyond rights, responsibilities. Responsibilities are a very important dimension of citizenship. So I think we should now focus upon our responsibilities. And this is where our responsibilities, like the responsibility to understand the history and evolution of our country, our responsibility towards our national language, our responsibility towards protecting the identities of different communities, our responsibility towards minorities. These must be seen as shared responsibilities. Apart from the responsibility to the environment, responsibility to the weak and vulnerable, and all the rest of it. Responsibilities have to become a very important dimension of the nation building process. And I would argue that from responsibilities we move to the final dimension. It is responsibilities which reveal to us how important empathy is in a society. Rights by themselves would never be able to show us the importance of empathy. Responsibilities open the door towards empathy. And empathy is vital in a multi-ethnic society. In trying to evolve a shared identity in the future, we have to develop this notion of empathy, really caring for the other, being able to put ourselves in the shoes of the other in the ethnic term, and the other in other terms. That's vital for the future of our society. Now, empathy, responsibilities, a certain notion of evolution, these have not become established dimensions of the nation building process, but we have to work towards them. And we have to understand why they are so critical at this juncture in our history. And that's the responsibility of the generation that will come after us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Chandra. Now, a question has just come up on WhatsApp. And this is related to what you said earlier about education and language being the two identity markers that the Chinese community often bring up again and again. And this seems to be an issue with the other communities who feel that vernacular education is in fact driving a major wedge between the different communities and is an obstacle. Vernacular education is an obstacle in the true integration of students, right, in schools. So, Dr. Chandra, what do you think can be a major education reform to go around this issue of the vernacular education? We know it cannot be abolished, but what can be done to actually go around it?
Well, unfortunately, the discussion about vernacular education in our country, it has not gone beyond platitudes and slogans. And I think that is part of the problem. What do we really mean by vernacular education as an obstacle? If we are talking about socialization in the school system, primary schools, yes, there is this dichotomy, and we have to find ways and means of overcoming it without abolishing primary schools as such, because I think that is a political hot potato. Now, if you keep the schools as they are and yet allow for a certain degree of socialization, of interaction, perhaps the idea of the vision schools of 1985 and so on, maybe these are things that we have to revisit on how you can enhance interaction amongst kids in that age group, 6 to 12 year age group. We can do that. And we can perhaps, with the new technologies, create more avenues for interaction amongst young kids. We can do that. And then secondary school, I think we have to strengthen that interaction if we can. I see that as a solution. without doing things which would create bigger problems, like wanting to abolish these schools and so on. But what is more important, I think, is to emphasize shared values. You can have kids studying geography in, say, the Chinese language or in Tamil. But if the values that you promote through that subject, or for that matter, other subjects, the values are values which transcend ethnic boundaries, that would be a contribution. And I think that can be done. We haven't given enough attention to this. In other words, move from the medium of instruction in education to underlying values and see how we can promote and strengthen underlying values that bring people together.
Thank you, Dr. Chandra. Now, I interviewed Tun Saleh Abbas just a couple of days ago, and he came up with this rather radical suggestion or proposal. In fact, I put the words into his mouth, that maybe we should have a major reform in the sense that for the first 3 years of primary education, all students go through the national stream, the Sekolah Kebangsaan, and make the medium bilingual, English, Malay, and have the POL, pupils' own language, at least for the first year. And then the second, year 2 and year 3 of primary education, you bring in the other subjects in the curriculum. Year 5 and year 6, 4, 5, 6, you consolidate the curriculum to prepare them for the examination. So in that sense, the first 3 years of Malaysian, the life of a Malaysian student, of Malaysian students, will be togetherness, going through the system together. What do you think? Quickly.
Well, thank you. Well, here again, I think the concern is with language as such. But my point is that if we move away from the medium of instruction, language, and start looking at underlying values and principles and so on, we don't really have to be that obsessed with this idea of 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, and so on. Now, along similar lines about the type of reforms we need, I think in terms of the content of primary education, we have to give much greater emphasis to language, and it has to be mainly Bahasa, but also other languages. The child has to develop a certain feel for languages. Apart from language, it has to be mathematics. I think that's very, very important. We don't do enough of that. This, I think, is going to be one of our major albatrosses of the future, that we don't give enough emphasis to mathematics, because that's where scientific, logical, rational thinking is developed. So I think language and mathematics, that should be what is emphasized in the primary schools.
Thank you, Dr. Chandra. We'll now move to our second speaker, Professor Emerita Wazir Jahan Karim, who hails from Penang. And the topic that she will be speaking on is assimilation or pluralism. Professor Wazir, the floor is yours. Would you like to unmute?
Yes. Is that better? Yeah. So firstly, I'd like to thank Brother Karan and Datuk Halima, and also Gerakbudaya for organizing this very interesting and important forum. I suppose it does coincide with Malaysia Day, when we need to discuss such interesting issues. My topic is on the relationship between pluralism and assimilation. Do we need both, and do we have both? I think Malaysia is more of a plural society. There's amazing amount of diversity in culture, in linguistic affiliation, and in politics as well. But we do not actually have a system of forced assimilation as what we have in Myanmar, for example, or in Thailand, where Muslims in the south have two sets of names, a formal Thai name for schools and an informal Muslim name, which they use at home. And in Indonesia, we know that minorities have to carry names that sound like Javanese. And similarly, we have problems of this in Vietnam. Now, of course, we also do have a national type school in Malaysia where every family is encouraged to put their kids in these national type schools. But Malaysia has practiced vernacular education ever since independence, and vernacular education is here to stay. And I think there is a certain amount of assimilation in it as well, where Malays and Tamils try to put their kids in Chinese vernacular schools, and where I think Muslims in particular are very interested to learn more Chinese because it seems to be emerging as a global language even in Southeast Asia. But over and above this, I think Malaysia has a problem of also defining what it is. What is this sense of national consciousness about being a Malaysian? Do we feel Malaysian enough? And is our identity really Malaysian in the context of politics, economics, cultural exchanges? I think our biggest problem is actually in the context of ethnic politics, that our party systems are very ethnically biased. And even when they try, when the party itself admits minorities from other populations, somehow these minorities don't feel they are well represented. And a party which is multi-ethnic becomes mono-ethnic. And this is a huge problem in parties which have a wider dimension of defining who the members are. So I think we have to work a lot from here. And there is this, okay, we do have diversity, but there's such a thing as galloping diversity, diversity gone wild, when we don't quite know how to reflect back and understand ourselves as Malaysians. I think from what Chandra was telling us, there is a certain level of consciousness of exchanges, of relationships which are intercultural or multi-ethnic. For example, like during cultural festivities, we do enjoy open houses and we enjoy sampling foods from other ethnic groups. Now, once we have cleared the dimension of what is halal and what is haram, I think it's fair game for everybody to try the food cooked by another ethnic community. And I think in Malaysia in particular, the food dimension is like incredible. Like, I bet that every single Malaysian in every small town or city would know where to go for the best nasi lemak or the best nasi kandar or rojak. And I know, like in Penang, for example, they would want to know where to go for the best rotis surai, as they call it in the south, roti jala, or the best biryani. I mean, there is a hunt for the best biryani in Penang. And people, would travel for miles. And I'm talking about the Chinese and the Indians who would travel for miles to try and find out where is the best ikan bakar being served and the best nasi Melayu campur, for example. So we're doing fine in the area of cultural exchanges for food. And I think this is a dimension which we could work on maybe more, because food is a road to happiness, and the road to, good food is a road to longevity. Like we know, for example, now there is a lot of interest in organic foods and revival of ulams and kerabu, which is very Malay. And this in itself tells us that we have reached a certain level of acceptance and tolerance and appreciation of the different dimensions of living together as Malaysians. In the area of sports, of course, I think most Malaysians would rally their support behind champion sportsmen and champion sportswomen, as we have seen here. And in the area of dance and music, of course, I think the average Malaysian would jump up and do a bhangra or do the roget and jongen, joget and ronggeng, and even appreciate the lion dance. I've seen in KL, for example, over the last Chinese New Year, how the lion dancers have taken over the streets and the malls of KL, and how young couples bring their children. I mean, these are like Malay and Tamil couples, Indian maybe, bring their children to enjoy these lion dances. And I know for a fact in Penang, how these lion dances are actually, their hands and their feet, the legs and the feet are actually managed and manipulated by Malays and Banglas. They get a lot of extra money doing that. So this is all very good and that, but is this enough? No, I think as Malaysians, we need to move forward and enjoy life-changing experiences from other communities. And one of this is actually to learn to appreciate the lifestyles and the livelihoods of other marginal communities beyond the mainstream Malay, Chinese, and Indian communities. And by this, I mean the farming communities of Malaysia, whether they are Chinese or whether they are Malay, the fishing communities on the coastal areas all along our peninsula and Sabah and Sarawak, and also the Orang Asli and Orang Asal. Now with the Orang Asli and the Orang Asal, I have a lot of experience on this. I've lived with the Orang Asli on Carey Island for a good 2 years, and I've experienced what it is like to actually experience abject poverty, living in the mangroves, which are being desertified by loggers and development around them, how they have to hunt for water in mud holes, and how we used to eat because we couldn't find proper protein, and how we used to eat monkey meat and snake and maggots from banana trees, and actually, raid wells to get good water to drink. And now, of course, it's quite different because most of these communities do have water and electricity. I think most of them do have it, but they're always short of food because they're being transferred and moved from one land to another. And, the new areas they moved in are actually quite desertified because the soil structure is actually very poor, and they're not able to recuperate the kind of lifestyles they had when they enjoyed the ancestral fruit trees, and when they enjoyed, their farms, the wild rice which they used to grow, paddy bake as they call it in Carey Island. Now all that is gone. So I think as Malaysians, if we could just bring our friends and families to live with these communities for a while. I don't mean 2 years the way we anthropologists had done that, because that might kill you. I mean like a day or two, or maybe a few hours or half a day, to bring your friends and to bring food and to exchange our food with them, and to listen to their stories, the narratives of long ago, and to empathize. I really like this word, empathize, because Chandra used it a lot. And for me, it is very similar to the notion of keinsafan in Malay. Kita insaf. You feel for these communities because they have suffered so much as we expanded our homes and as we moved to live in big housing estates, which were once their homelands. I'm not sure if most of you know that most of the houses built around Damansara, Sungai Penchala, right up to Kota Damansara, are houses where the Temuans, the early Brandas communities used to live, even as far as the Selangor Club. They used to live here even before the other mainstream communities came in, the Bugis and the Mandailing and the Minang people of the Indonesian islands. So I think we owe them a lot. You know, they have made sacrifices for us, and they have actually moved to areas which are less fertile. And I think this sense of keinsafan will make us feel a deeper sense of gratitude and appreciation and tolerance of one another. And I think most Malaysians would appreciate the Hari Gawai or the Hari Moyang on Carey Island and enjoy the music and dance and see how they need desperately their stories and narratives of the past, because this is what gives them their origin as true Malaysians, as the early Malaysians of this country. And I think we do have a lot to move on to develop this life-changing experience. And I think Malaysians are generally very sympathetic, and they are basically very humane. Malaysians are, I think, are also very disciplined people and very caring. Now we know, like during the COVID-19 lockdown, most Malaysians rallied together and supported one another and actually um, learn to appreciate the sense of control which the Ministry of Health gave us, a sense of wanting to be disciplined and obedient and wanting to save us from a pandemic which would be out of control. And we have seen how it's become out of control in other countries in Southeast Asia. And we as Malaysians, I think, should be proud that we have learned to control this to this amazing level. Of course, there are pockets here and there, and there's spikes all the time. We do have this, but generally as Malaysians, I think we have done really well. And we should applaud ourselves, whether we are Malay, Chinese, Indians, you know, Orang Asli, we have done really well in this area. So I would like to actually say that despite everything and despite the negativity and despite the sense of wanting to relate more to ourselves as an ethnic community, we actually do have an identity as Malaysians. And if we work more at this, if we work more at this and experience a greater sense of tolerance, appreciation, and keinsafan, we would be a very healthy, happy nation. And I think this is what we need to be. Enjoy this pursuit of happiness, find it, search it, and enjoy longevity for us and for everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wazir. I thought you were going to show some slides. Are they going to be shown?
I think Nadine will put it on the chat, I think.
Right.
Yes.
It's on the chat. All right, thank you. Now, there is a question from Andrew Koo, all right, and he'd like to ask you, Dr. Wazir, is there a difference between a multiracial society and a plural society? If there is a difference, what are the different features and which would Malaysia be?
Well, Malaysia is always identified as multicultural, multiracial. But I would think that a country which is multiracial is probably closer to a country like Canada or Australia, or maybe in New Zealand, where there are many different ethnic groups of different types, maybe even sub-ethnic groups, but where they have a sense of absolute unity in education, in a sense of understanding themselves as Australians, and a sense of belonging to themselves as a nation. I think plural societies are those similar to societies like Malaysia, maybe South Africa, where we actually preserve or conserve that sense of identity of being of a certain ethnic type. And to be of a certain ethnic type is what has been expressed earlier, actually does mean defining ourselves as an ethnic or sub-ethnic category. And I think this is very prevalent and very strong in Malaysia. There are, of course, hybrid communities like the Jawi Peranakan and the Chinese Peranakan, the Straits Chinese and the Straits Muslims, and the Eurasian communities, for example, who are possibly, I would say, very comfortable with being multicultural and multi-ethnic. And they would be, I think, very similar to the kind of citizens of the kind of people you would find in those other countries I mentioned. I think we haven't really left where we came from, which is post-independence Malaya. And I think we have a lot to work on to be true multicultural. I know, as you know, myself as a Jawi Peranakan, as a quintessential, hybrid community of Penang, I fit very much in all the hybrid communities here, which we have in Penang and in Malacca, of course, we have those. And, this is something very unique to the Straits settlements, to the Straits metropolis. We don't have this in the East Coast, or we don't have this on the West Coast, really. So if you could work more on that, I think that might be quite good. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Wazir. There's another pointed question here, right? A pluralistic society naturally begets ethnic politics and ethnic parties. Don't we have to rework our integrative social system in order to create a different mode of politics? First question. Or do you think a culturally pluralist society can coexist with a with a nationally assimilated political system? Tough one.
Yeah, I'm sure others could answer that better than me. Well, I think we really have to be concerned about our ethnic politics in Malaysia. I feel, as an anthropologist who has worked on so many different cultures and who sits on the boundaries of cultural identity, this is not very healthy. Even for parties to be defined through faith, through religion, this is even more concerning for us as Malaysians. I think if we could just overcome this whole idea of us voting, for example, voters as Malays, or wanting to find more Malay votes or more Chinese votes, this could actually, help us a lot. Like, the campaigning process in Malaysia is definitely ethnic. And political leaders in Malaysia sit on ethnic votes. They don't sit on Malaysian votes. I do feel the millennials in Malaysia who have gone through a very moderate system of education in the English medium, Malay medium, do feel very concerned about this. And we do have a lot of young Malaysians moving away from ethnic politics and wanting to see this changing rapidly, but it's not taking place. And I'm not quite sure how we can do this, whether we can really redefine our ethnic boundaries in a way which is much more healthy, or whether what you mentioned, this integrative policies should take place first. I don't think that will work because it's too macro. And what we're feeling is, what we are tackling with now are emotions, hostilities, prejudice, hate, racism, which we seldom discuss because as Malaysians, we don't like to do this. We like to keep the ball going and say that we are doing okay. But there's a lot of that in social media. And there's a lot of that actually in ethnic politics. And we don't want this. The average Malaysian doesn't want this. I know that. But how do we change the mindsets of our leaders? Maybe they should take these courses in integration and not us. Maybe they should define the Rukun Negara again for themselves and not us. I think we are actually very concerned about this, but you know, this whole thing about voting and campaigning for one ethnic type, that's not working. Thank you.
Right. We seem to have, we seem to be coming full circle again, and the fingers are pointing at politics and the politicians who are in fact instigating this dissension and differing voices. So it's something that we have to take up in Parliament with the parliamentarians and aduns. Right. Thank you, Professor Wazir. Our next speaker is Professor Said Farid Alatas, all the way from Singapore, and he will talk on fluidity of identities in a globalizing multicultural world. Farid?
Thank you very much, Dr. Halima, and also to Mr. Prabha for organizing this session. Salam sejahtera and peace to everyone, especially to fellow Malaysians. You have the title of my presentation, but to be more specific, I'd like to talk about multiculturalism and the importance of multiculturalism and the relevance of the Rukun Negara to that. So I have a few points to make. First of all, in a multi-ethnic society like Malaysia, in a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society like Malaysia, there cannot be a genuine nation without multiculturalism. I think that is something that we have to realize, and we, of course, we realize it, but I think a lot of people don't realize it. Now, it's important for us to understand that multiculturalism is not the same thing as multiracial. I mean, we are a multiracial society in the sense that there are many, ethnic groups, many religious groups. We are multiracial and multi-religious, but we do not necessarily have a multicultural orientation. So when I refer to multiculturalism, I'm referring to not just the presence of diverse cultures, but an attitude, an orientation that is multicultural, an attitude that is founded on the attributes of mutual understanding, of interest, and of compassion for each other, whether the other is, belongs to another ethnic group or the other belongs to another religious group. So, this is what I'm referring to as the spirit of multiculturalism. Now, and of course, the spirit of multiculturalism can be expressed and should be expressed in various ways, in various institutions. It should be expressed in politics. It should be expressed in education. It should be expressed in various realms of our lives. And we can see that in Malaysia, it is expressed more in certain realms of our lives than in others. For example, and has been pointed out by Professor Wazir, it's expressed in cuisine very clearly. Malaysians don't discriminate and distinguish between, the cuisine of different ethnic groups. We love the cuisine. We love each other's cuisine. We might hate each other's language, and this is the problem because the politics gets into that. So you have hate speech against this language, against that language. You have people calling for the closure of vernacular schools. But when it comes to cuisine, when it comes to even music, we have a great deal of interest, compassion, understanding, fusion. When you speak about fusion cuisine or fusion music. So we've done well in some realms of life in terms of forging a sense of multiculturalism, but very poorly in other areas. In education, for example, it has been already touched upon, this whole issue of vernacular schools is based on a very false dichotomy between vernacular and national. It's a kind of primitive thinking. because it is not that we have a choice between one or the other. It is certainly very possible to allow the various communities to to study in their own languages, specifically in Mandarin and Tamil, but also to study in the national language. It's not the issue of whether you teach in the vernacular language or the national language. The issue is the kinds, as was pointed out by Dr. Chandra, the value system that that is promoted through the education system, and also the structure. Are you going to have schools in which you allow for integration, you allow for assimilation, you allow for contact between the different ethnic groups and religious groups, regardless of the medium of instruction that they are studying in? You have to have the right values, regardless of the medium of instruction, and the right structure such that there can be meeting, there can be integration, there can be friendships can develop, and so on and so forth. Now, what I'm saying is very simple, and it can easily be solved. It's just a matter of political will. How do you create an education system which allows for both the teaching of the national language and allows for people to study in the national language, as well as to develop competency in their own languages, in their own ethnic languages, and allows them to promote their own languages. It's not a problem of education. It's not a problem that lies in the science of education, in pedagogy. It is a political problem. Now, I agree with the sentiments of previous speakers that I think it was Wazir was saying that Malaysians are humane and sympathetic. We are, and we had a good start in the early days. For example, in the area of interreligious dialogue, we had formed one of the first. We established one of the first interreligious organizations in the world, actually. This was in the 1940s, the Interreligious Organization, the IRO. The specific name was the Interreligious Organization of Singapore and Johor Bahru. This was in the 40s. And it was spearheaded by Muslims, actually. But the IRO, the Malaysian side of it fizzled out. But it has continued in Singapore to this day, in which 10 religions are represented. In Malaysia today, we find at the elite level a great deal of hate speech directed at different ethnic groups, directed at different religious groups. Even among Muslims, you have a great deal of sectarianism, where you have, hate speech spewing out of the mouths of some politicians and some religious leaders, hate speech against Shiites, hate speech against Salafis. I think there's nothing wrong with having views or positions, against one group or another, but it should not take the form of irrational hate speech. We've seen in the last years anti-Hindu sentiments from among certain Malay sections. We have seen Christian bashing going on. All of these examples, they may be coming from the elite and not from the rakyat, but the danger is that they filter down to the rakyat gradually if they are not nipped in the bud. And there are indications of the lack of multicultural sensibility among our leaders, whether politicians or other kinds of elite, like religious elite. With regard to the perception of, if you take Hinduism, for example, the majority of Malaysians are not anti-Hindu and are not engaging in anti-Hindu hate speech. They are just, a tiny fraction of, people who engage in such speech. But the vast majority of Malaysians, and certainly the vast majority of Malays, have a very primitive understanding of Hinduism. They don't understand the Hindu faith. They don't understand its sophisticated philosophy. They don't understand its sophisticated theological ideas. They simply associate Hinduism with idol worship, and they look down on it without having any understanding and empathy. And that goes against Islamic tradition, because if you look at Islamic tradition, you look at the writings of the 11th century, the 10th century Muslim scholar Abu Rayhan al-Biruni. He lived in India for 13 years. He studied Sanskrit, he studied Hinduism, and in order to correct the misconceptions that Muslims had about Hinduism. And that's what our tradition is about. It's about understanding the truth and forging ties and understanding with other religious communities. That has been the spirit of Islam for centuries. So we are a multiracial society, but we are not multiculturalist in orientation. Now, in calling for multiculturalism, and in a little while I want to talk about the role of the Rukun Negara, but let me just say now that in calling for a multiculturalist orientation, we should not confuse that with the idea of plural society. Actually, we do not want a plural society. See, the plural society is an idea that was, started by Furnival, the scholar of colonial Burma and Indonesia. Now, in the notion of the plural society, how he defined it, it was a society consisting of various ethnic groups that coexisted, but did not have much interaction with each other. They only interacted with each other at the marketplace. They came to the marketplace, they interacted with each other, then they went back to their respective homes, their respective communities, their respective, spaces, geographical spaces, and didn't have much to do with each other, did not understand each other, had little empathy for each other. In other words, in Furnival's conception, the plural society was not founded on multiculturalism. So we need to make that distinction. Now, the lack of multiculturalism in Malaysia is also reflected in the way our history is understood, in the way our history is written. You have ultra-nationalist, ultra-Malay nationalist ideas informing certain historical works, which deny or suppress the role of non-Malays in Malaysian history, which refer to the role of non-Malays as unimportant, as fragmentary, which is not only untrue but also quite insulting to the non-Malays. So you have a kind of chauvinism that's expressed in historical writing, and this chauvinism, of course, is the opposite of a more multiculturalist spirit in the writing of our history. So there are many things that we need to do, of course, to forge this multiculturalism in terms of education, in terms of conscientizing people, and in terms of forcing, and pressuring the elite to be more open to the idea of multiculturalism. And one area, of course, that I think needs to be worked on has to do with the role of the Rukun Negara. In fact, Dr. Chandra had, I think, played a very important role in reviving, in reminding Malaysians some years ago about the importance of the Rukun Negara, and he's spoken about the need for. He's spoken about, for example, the idea that the Rukun Negara should be placed as the preamble or the introduction to the Constitution, which I think is a very important idea. A few things that I'd like to say in this respect. So it happens that my father was on the Rukun Negara committee that was established by the National Consultative Council right after a few months after the May 1969 riots. And in that, during that period, there were some interesting, things that happened. Of course, the Rukun Negara itself, in terms of what my father had written about it, he was involved in the drafting of the Rukun Negara, and he also wrote about it. He gave various talks in Malaysia, and there's some, and he's written about he had written about the relevance or the significance of Rukun Negara, and he, of course, made it clear that the objectives and principles of the Rukun Negara were already contained in the Constitution, but that the Rukun Negara spelled those principles out in terms that were more easily or readily understood by the people, by everyone, by people from all walks of life. But he also, emphasized that there were some aspects of the Rukun Negara which were stressed that were not necessarily clearly stated in the Constitution. So for these reasons, he suggested, and this was in a publication in July 1971, that the Rukun Negara, that we should consider placing the Rukun Negara as the introduction of the preamble to the Constitution. And actually he had also mentioned, and this is quite interesting, that Dato' On bin Jaafar had some years before that, many years before that, had privately mentioned to him that he, Dato' On, had regretted that there was no preamble to the Malaysian Constitution. So it's quite interesting that, my father had heard that remark from Dato' On and then suggested that there should be a preamble to the Constitution. Now, when we look at the Rukun Negara, it embodies some fundamental principles that had already by that time been accepted or were deemed to be acceptable to the majority of Malaysians. And it was an effort, an effort of the government, at that time the alliance government, as well as parties, most of the parties from the opposition, and it represented the views of different sections of society, both Malays and non-Malays. And the idea of the Rukun Negara, of course, was to preserve national peace, to preserve peace among the different ethnic and religious communities, but also to preserve democracy. So the idea was not to preserve peace at all costs at the expense of democracy. In other words, not to allow, in the words of Tunku Abdul Rahman, not to allow democracy to be, not to allow democracy from becoming a play, right? This is, and my father had noted that as well. Now, these ideas, of course, are still relevant today. The spirit of the Rukun Negara was expressed by my father when he was national chairman of Gerakan, and in that capacity, he said that if we really follow the spirit of the Rukun Negara, it means that we would not exploit communal issues. We would speak with a decent and appropriate vocabulary. I'm citing him. so as not to hurt the feelings of any community. We would regard certain basic principles as the foundation of our democracy, and to consider these principles as above political criticism. We would respect and uphold the Constitution to prevent politicians from playing the game of political expedience in agreeing with the Constitution. We would put up a radical fight against corruption and against decadent people. We would not criticize the constitutional provisions on the Malays as though they are in, we would not criticize the constitutional provisions on the Malays. We would not question, and this is interesting from that, the perspective of that period, we would not question the loyalty of citizens who criticize the government or those who do not speak Malay. We would not allow the idea of Bumiputra to be a divisive factor, and so on and so forth. You know, some of those ideas, many of those ideas are still very much relevant to our problems today. There's one...
Prof. Farid, I think time's up.
No, I just have to wrap up right now. Can I just please finish?
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. No, I just want to end with this point. The Rukun Negara was drafted in English and it was translated to Malay. And the committee which was responsible for drafting it in English was also responsible for translating it to Malay. And I believe a subcommittee was established to work on the translation. Now, in the minutes, it's interesting that, you know, my father, I think, was maybe the most involved in the criticism of the first draft Malay translation of the Rukun Negara. And he had many comments to make about, you know, the use of certain terms. Now, one of the things which he said, some of the suggestions that he made were taken into account. But one suggestion that he made, which was not taken into account, he suggested that the term bangsa be used instead of negara. Negara here supposedly referring to country or nation. He suggested that the term bangsa be used because of the ambiguous meaning of negara, because negara could mean nation, it could also mean the state, right? Whereas bangsa has a less ambiguous meaning. So his idea was actually, you know, suggesting the idea of Bangsa Malaysia. Dr. Mahathir is usually credited with having come up with the idea in the 1990s, I think in 1995, the idea of Bangsa Malaysia. But I think the idea was suggested in the context of Rukun Negara about 25 years before that. So it's high time that, you know, we return to this idea of Bangsa Malaysia, which is in the spirit of the Rukun Negara, as is also the idea of liberal society, progressive society. These words are mentioned in the Rukun Negara. The Rukun Negara refers to the building of a liberal and progressive society, which have become dirty words among certain politicians and certain religious leaders today. So these politicians and religious leaders are against the spirit of the Rukun Negara, and we need to urge them to return to the spirit of the Rukun Negara, which was accepted by all Malaysians. You know, it was what do you call it? It was declared by the Agong, by the government, by all different political parties, and accepted by Malaysians of all walks of life. So let's return to that. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Prof. Farid. Now, you know, I had a very interesting Zoom chat with your sister, Sharifa Mastura, who lives in Italy. And I've uploaded it on my Facebook. So people who are interested in, you know, listening to the chat. It was a 50-minute chat with Sharifa Mastura, and we delved in some detail into the Rukun Negara and the role which Syed Hussein Alatas played. Right, thank you, Farid. Now, there is a question from Andrew Koo, another question from Andrew Koo, which actually you've already mentioned it. So I will still pose the question to you and you can pick it up again, yeah? Now, would you agree that this periodic resort to the Rukun Negara is insincere, used merely as a band-aid for religious and racial tensions? Because if one reads the full text of the Rukun Negara and not just the 5 slogans, there is a call for a liberal attitude to customs and a progressive advancement of society. Yet liberalism today is viewed as a threat to national security. Can you have your liberal cake and eat it too, Professor Farid?
Yeah, well, Mr. Koo, I don't know who you're suggesting is being insincere. It's up to all of us to, to promote the Rukun Negara and to urge our elite, our political leaders, and all the other kinds of elite that we have in the country, the religious elite, the elite in the arts, the journalists, and so on, all have to be, encouraged and urged to promote the Rukun Negara. The Rukun Negara is there. It's part of our history. It's, as Dr. Chandra stated, it's related to the Constitution. It was declared, and revealed to Malaysians by the Agong. It has to be taken seriously. Now, if some people take it as a band-aid, that's very unfortunate. But I think we need to promote an understanding. For example, this idea that the Rukun Negara promotes liberal society and progressive thinking, that has to be promoted. So that people are not duped into thinking that liberal ideas, are a threat to national security, or liberal ideas are un-Islamic. People have to be made to understand that, for example, what is a threat to national security and what is at odds with the values of our respective religious traditions is, for example, neoliberalism or corruption, and so on and so forth. And the Rukun Negara is against these things as well. The spirit of the Rukun Negara is against these things. Of course, there are some people who are insincere and may even, I can imagine, many politicians paying lip service to Rukun Negara for their own ends. That's always the case. But we as people, as academics, as intellectuals, as people in civil society, and the general public, it's our responsibility to promote the progressive ideas, and that includes the Rukun Negara, so that the Rakyat take it seriously, and hopefully the Rakyat can force the hand of those in positions of power.
Yes, in the same chat with Sharifah Mastura, I suggested that perhaps on top of political will, there should be Rakyat will, which should be greater, more powerful than political will. Then only will some kind of, real reform take place in the country.
Mm-hmm.
So we go on next to our next speaker, Judge David Alfred, who's going to talk about Rukun Negara and enhancement of interethnic, interfaith relations. Over to you, David.
Thank you, and good evening. When you mentioned Dr. Onn bin Jaafar, I was thinking he was really the pioneer of a multiracial nation. And it is ironic that when he left UMNO and formed the Independence of Malaya Party, it was on the 16th of September, 1951. Was he to know that 12 years later, on that same date, Malaysia would be formed? 1 year after his untimely demise in 1962. I'm going to talk about a subject that is both topical and significant. It is the Rukun Negara. These are the national principles which fulfill what in other constitutions would be called the preamble. The fact that they come after the Constitution in point of time does not, in my opinion, preclude them from being the preamble or the prequel to the Constitution. This is because they embody the aspirations, the vision, and the fundamental basis of the Constitution. Because we are talking about Malaysia and not about one component, I will start by talking about the background. The Constitution from the start makes it clear that Malaysia is a federation which shall be known as Malaysia in English and in Malay by the name of Malaysia. At its inception, 4 national states constituted the new country. There were 4 states that had become independent of British rule on various dates. They were 1, the Federation of Malaya on 31st August 1957, 2, North Borneo on 31st August 1963, Sarawak on 31st August 1963. Those Sarawakians would contend that British rule ended on 22nd July 1963 when the last British governor departed. 4, Singapore on 31 August 1963. When these 4 former British protectorates and crown colonies joined together, it was to establish Malaysia on 16 September 1963. Then the relevant constitutional clause and Section 4 of the Malaysia Act read as follows. The states of the Federation shall be A, the states of Malaya, the 11 states are named, B, the Borneo states, namely Sabah and Sarawak, C, the state of Singapore. The state of Singapore left the Federation on 9 August 1965 by an agreement between the central government and the government of Singapore. To the credit of all, the separation was effected in a peaceful manner. In May 1969, there was tragically some incidents of violence and bloodshed in Kuala Lumpur and some other places in Malaya only. It was with the clear intention that these incidents should not be allowed to recur that the Rukun Negara were formulated. And since they were declared by the Yang di-Pertuan Agong on 31 August 1970, and since they had the approval of the majority of the Dewan Rakyat, the Rukun Negara are sacrosanct. They are inviolable. They are not to be subject to the passing tides of time or changing views. I have started with this brief background because my talk is inspired by the wisdom in the Malay proverb, "Sesat di ujung jalan, balik ke pangkal jalan." And that is precisely what I shall try to do now, to advance the narrative of how the Rukun Negara can enhance the inter-ethnic and interfaith relations. Like every civilized, democratic, multi-ethnic, multi-faith society, Malaysia's aspirations are the following. 1, to achieve greater unity of all her peoples. 2, to maintain a democratic way of life. 3, to create a just society where the national prosperity shall be equitably shared. 4, to ensure a liberal approach to the rich and diverse cultural traditions. 5, to build a progressive society which shall be oriented to science and technology. I shall now go briefly through the above aspirations. To achieve unity in a multi-ethnic and multi-faith society is not an impossible task in the 21st century. Look at Switzerland, look at Canada, look at South Africa. These are countries with 4, with 2, with 11 official languages, with 4, with 3, with a multiplicity of ethnic groups, respectively, yet all are thriving and united. If someone wants to know our aspirations, he can peruse the declaration of our Rukun Negara. If someone wanted to know the aspirations of the United States, he could not find them in the Constitution of 1787. He would have to find them in the Declaration of Independence 11 years earlier. There, the most significant part of the preamble are that 1, these truths are evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and to achieve these rights, governments are instituted among men, receiving their just powers from the consent of the governed. The preamble, like the Pancasila of Indonesia of June 1945, have remained unchanged. Second, a democratic way of life is worth striving for. Citizens vote in a free, fair, transparent, and competitive election to appoint a government of their own choice. Democracy has been defined as government of the people, by the people, for the people. Often forgotten is the requirement it should also be for the benefit of the populace. 3, a just society is not a utopian dream. It only requires restraint on the part of those who have, so that there is no conspicuous consumption on their part when the have-nots suffer in poverty and destitution. The fair and equitable approach required is to ensure those who indulge in their ill-gotten gains are made to disgorge them. Policies that are meant to assist the indigent should not be hijacked by the affluent. 4, Malaysia has been blessed with a rich variety of cultures and traditions. We should therefore display a liberal approach, which means having a generous, broad-minded, tolerant, and unbigoted attitude to the myriad of these cultural traditions. 5, we should be seriously building a progressive society that will make full use of science and modern technology. To progress, a community is obliged to be dynamic, enterprising, forward-looking, contemporary, and up-to-date. I turn now to the first pillar of the Rukun Negara, belief in God. The fact is, we live in a green and pleasant land, endowed with much natural resources. The human race did not arrive on Earth by an evolutionary accident. It was due to the benevolence of God who created the human race. It is to him that we owe the peace and harmony that we enjoy as Malaysians. And freedom of religion is guaranteed by Article 11.1 of the Constitution. Second, loyalty to king and country. The best way of exemplifying this is to look at the constitutional monarchy par excellence, that of the United Kingdom. The national anthem is God Save the Queen. This does not mean that the Queen is to be put above the kingdom. It means she is the symbol of the country, the repository of the virtues and the best interests of the nation. So when her peoples pray for divine protection for the Queen, they are asking for the preservation of their liberties, rights, and freedoms. That is why in a constitutional monarchy, the government is called His Majesty's government, and the opposition, His Majesty's loyal opposition. The latter is supposed to be the government in waiting. The next rukun requires the upholding of the supremacy of the Constitution. Article 4 of the Constitution states, the Constitution is the supreme law of the Federation, and any law passed which is inconsistent with it shall be void to the extent of the inconsistency. Void means annulled or invalid, terbatal. Constitutions of other countries, including the United States, Australia, and India before us, and South Africa and Fiji after us, have the same supremacy. It is the Constitution which is supreme, not Parliament. This principle needs no further elaboration. 4. Coming up now is the rule of law. The best known exposition of this was by Professor Dicey of the University of Oxford. He gave it 3 meanings. First, The regular law is predominant and excludes arbitrary power. A citizen knows the consequences if he breaks the law, and he will only be punished if he breaches the law. The law to which he is subject is the ordinary law enacted by Parliament, and it is only in the ordinary courts that he is to be tried. Second, equality before the law. This means no one is above the law. State officials are just like the ordinary citizens and duty-bound to obey the same law. In other words, all classes of men are equally subject to the ordinary law of the land. Administered by the ordinary law courts. 300 years ago, an English jurist, Thomas Fuller, said, "Be you never so high, the law is above you." I think that says it all, even in 2020. 3, the citizen whose fundamental rights are infringed may seek his remedy in the courts. It is for this reason that every citizen should watch carefully that there are no encroachment into the province of the judicial branch by another branch of government, because it is the judiciary which is the guardian of the rights of the citizen, and any restriction on his access to the courts for a remedy injures and harms his rights. You can get this from Constitutional Law by Wade and Bradley. 5, we come now to the 5th and final principle, good behavior and morality. We are thus required to be civil, considerate, well-mannered in all circumstances. I use the word circumstances. I did not use the word times. This way, showing we are well-bred or we are well brought up. Thus, we evince our morality by knowing the difference between right and wrong and between good and bad. At the end of the day, we consider how the Rukun Negara has succeeded in the last 50 years to nurture and increase good inter-ethnic and inter-religious relations amongst the peoples of Malaysia. Ethnicity means belonging to a social group, possessing a common cultural tradition. In this, ethnicity is different from nationality. We are all Malaysian nationals, owing our undivided loyalty to Malaysia. But we are not all of the same cultural tradition. We recognize that we do not all possess the same culture, the same history, or the same mother tongue. But that should not lead to disunity. The raison d'etre for the Rukun Negara is to ensure this wonderful country of ours is always blessed with peace, with harmony, with unity. We acknowledge that though comprised of different ethnic groups, we can only exist as one people. And we have to be united to be strong among the nations of the world. The bedrock of Malaysia is the unity of the people. Other nations have to search or to create unity. We have this unity already as the bedrock of our nation. If we go back to the Federation of Malaya, which was established on 1 February 1948, we see that it faced an existential threat.
Can you just sum up in about 30 seconds, please?
30 seconds, yes. Let me end by quoting another Malay proverb. Apa gadokan, pengayu sama di tangan, merayu sama di air. The ship of state should proceed on an even keel if it is to reach the safe haven. It is the bounden duty of all Malaysians to apply the sacrosanct principles yang diagungkan dan tidak harus dirosakkan of the Rukun Negara and the Constitution in tandem.
Thank you, Judge David. Right. I don't know how to do this, but referring back to Andrew Khoo's comment about the insincerity of people who are revitalizing Rukun Negara, I would like to just suggest an impertinent, but I think a pertinent issue, which is that of public morality. And this is something that Syed Hussein Al-Attas wanted to insert as the sixth principle, Prof. Farid, in the meeting notes here. Syed Hussein Al-Attas suggested that we insert the sixth principle to make Rukun Negara, our Rukun Negara, a little bit different from Pancasila and Rukun Islam. But also he believed that public morality is an area that needed to be attended to, all in the context of corruption. And this is something I think we can agree has been sorely neglected. And people must be sincere about wanting to, to exercise this sense of morality. The other thing is belief in God, Judge David. Belief in God is argued by some, although a minority. The agnostics and atheists are arguing that the Rukun Negara is not inclusive of them. All right, belief in God with a capital G. All right. Now, Prabha and I, Prabhakara and I discussed this the other day, and we thought that if there can be a rewording of Rukun Negara, slight rewording, not changing, we could change it to belief in the Almighty, yeah, Yang Maha Esa, which encompasses the all-powerful, the almighty superpower, right? Now, there is a question for you from on Facebook, Judge David. It says here, the Malaysian Constitution was amended to make certain issues non-disputable. For example, national language, special position of the Malays of the Federation of Malaya and the natives of Sabah and Sarawak, and the position of the Malay rulers. Wouldn't the retrofitting of the Rukun Negara as the preamble to the Constitution merely reinforce the inequalities entrenched in some of these provisions? right? Would you like to answer that question?
Yes, I think it is very clear that these things that are suggested by the agnostic and the atheists, including the term Maha Esa, Lord God Almighty, it's all a matter of semantics. The agnostic says there is no way of proving whether there is a God or not. The atheist says categorically there's no God. But I think we have to proceed on the very sound basis that there is a creator, and we can call that creator by whatever name we desire, but we cannot run away from the fact that there is a creator. So therefore, like the Panchasila, like the preamble to the United States Constitution, or Declaration of Independence, which predated, and like the Rukun Negara, I think it's absolutely necessary and absolutely sound to say that we believe in God. And I state this in a very unequivocal fashion: believe in God. Now, where we are talking about equality, we have to read the whole of that article of the Constitution. I think it's 153 or 152. It says that the Yang di-Pertuan Agong is also required to protect the legitimate interests of the other communities. We cannot read half the sentence and put a full stop there. The full stop comes after His Majesty looks after the interests of the other communities as well. Finally, after May 13, there was an amendment that even a member of parliament who makes a seditious statement in parliament is not immune by parliamentary immunity from being prosecuted under the Sedition Act. I remember many years ago, Muhammad Azmi, Mr. Justice Muhammad Azmi, convicted the late Mark Kodin, member of parliament from Sabah, for making a seditious statement in parliament. I think it related to the abolition of certain types of schools. So the Constitution, in its basic structure, is inviolable, but it is moving along to protect the interests of everyone as and when that is deemed necessary. That is my response to that series of questions.
Thank you, Judge David. Right, now we move on to our last but not least speaker. In fact, Tricia is the youngest of the speakers, MS Tricia Yeo, who is going to address the topic, is oneness of identity a necessity in nation building? Tricia.
Firstly, thank you very much to Gerakbudaya and History of Nation Building for inviting me to speak. Very honored to be amongst all the esteemed speakers this afternoon, former judges, renowned academics as well. So I will qualify my remarks by saying that first, I come from a public policy background. So I've been working in public policy research and advocacy for 10 over years, and I'm also still pursuing a PhD in politics. So I'm looking at it very much, and I see Malaysia and the world very much in terms of systems and institutions, even as we talk about nation building. So with that preface, I will go on to talk about the topic that's been given today. So the question that's been given is oneness of identity a necessity in nation building? For those of you who can't stay for the 15 minutes, my short answer is no. And I will spend the next 15 minutes talking about why I don't think oneness of identity is a necessity in nation building. I have 3 parts to my talk today. The first part, I'm kind of drawing a lot on a book that has influenced me actually a lot in my work over the last decade. And that is Amartya Sen's Identity and Violence. And I'm quoting quite a bit from that book. The second part is basically looking at that in the context of Malaysia. And then finally, my final part is what do I see as the solution in terms of going forward and nation building. So one of the main premise of the book that I just mentioned, Identity and Violence, which I think describes a lot of what we face today, and increasingly so, right? The book was, I think, published in 2006. And he's saying that while identity has great values, so the values of inclusion, where members share the same traits, these wonderful values of inclusion, and you can imagine that the traits that make up a strong identity, even if, say, it's a Malaysian identity, a lot of you talked about food and so on, can also in the same breath make them values of exclusion, right? So a non-Malaysian would not partake within those identity traits. People who don't like Malaysian food, for example, would not partake within that particular group ethic. So yes, the idea of identity received, such widespread admiration, and a strong and an exclusive sense of belonging to one group can, in many cases, carry with it also at the same time the perception of distance and divergence from other groups. So the kind of within group solidarity that even we celebrate when we talk about being Malaysian can also help to feed between group discord. So I think we should recognize that a good and a well-integrated community, and you can imagine a community of, say, neighbors within a kampong where the residents do wonderful things for each other, and solidarity can also very well be the same community in which, and I quote from the book, like bricks are thrown through the windows of immigrants who move into the region from elsewhere, and the adversity of exclusion can be made to go hand in hand with the gifts of inclusion. So identity is a strong marker, which defines inclusivity and can also define exclusivity. However, having said that, he then goes on to say that a solitarian approach is a way of misunderstanding nearly everyone in the world. So the basic premise of the book is that it is not helpful to have a solitarian approach to identity. And the reason for that is because we all have multiple identities, such as, and not exclusive to, things like nationalities, locations, classes, occupations, social status, language, politics, political preference, for instance, gender, food habits, sport habits, taste in music, social commitments, and so many others. And this means that one person could simultaneously belong to these multiple identity groups. And none of them can be or should be taken to be the person's only identity or a singular membership category. So having said all that, and I think that while I like what he had tried to say in the book, I also think that there can be some problematic critiques of that. And I'll get to that in analyzing Malaysia right now. So this is my second part. So I think Malaysia has precisely the problem that Sen had identified, more than a decade ago, as a solitarian approach of understanding ourselves. It does not help that within Malaysia, there is a large majority of the population that is actually defined along, and we can discuss this, along a rather hard and common line. So many of you talked about the Constitution earlier, and the Constitution actually does define a Malay person as someone who practices the religion of Islam. That's one of the 3 qualifying definitions. And because the majority of the population, largely come from not just a similar ethnic background and a religious background, they also largely therefore come from similar cultural backgrounds and commonalities. And so one would believe that this is one of the problems, is that it lays the ground for a large population, a large proportion of the population to define themselves along a singular identity. And I want to take it a step further also to say that this line of singular thinking, of solitary or singular thinking, however you want to define it, it actually works to the advantage of political parties that aim to market themselves to singular communities along the lines of singular communal identity. Thus was the very formation of Barisan Nasional at the very beginning. We know that the history of Barisan Nasional had very good ideals and it started out well, but I would also posit, and this would be the hypothesis, that it also laid the ground of solidifying singular identities along the lines of race, which the parties perpetuated and, importantly, advantage from perpetuating. So, what that means is that when you market yourself to a singular ethnic community, you benefit from that, because that is how the party actually gains from constituents, votes, and through the electoral and political process. Added to that was when, in 1971, post the 1969 racial riots, which some of you have referred to, added to that was when in 1971, economic privileges became institutionally married to, tied to, inextricably linked to the precise singular identity that was being built by the, what I call a sort of nation, state, and party holy trinity of the Barisan Nasional. And this is where it becomes increasingly problematic, because what you have is no longer just the definition of a singular identity, but a singular identity and institutionalized rights linked inextricably to that singular identity. What that has created is a system which has no incentive to celebrate multiple identities, right? So the multiple identities that I brought up in the first section of the talk earlier, the fact that we're not just Chinese and Malay and Indian, but we are also multiple things. We are also, members of certain associations. We have perhaps different political ideologies and beliefs. We come from different states, right? We come from Kelantan, Penang, and so on. So that is actually a reality that has not been put forward as much by the political system, because there have not been any incentives to do that. So the reality is that Malaysians do have multiple identities. As I said, the Kelantanese, the Penangites, they are extremely proud of their state origins. Politics as well, aligning ideologically to certain ideas, identities of which schools you come from. I think some of the schools, like for instance, MCKK, St. John's Institution, some of these schools have very, very strong identity markers. And of course, language is a strong identity marker as well. So I'll just come to the last part, which is where I talk about solutions. And I don't intend to take too much longer. I actually prefer to have much more of a discussion with people who are asking questions. Is that, again, if I quote from Sen, the main hope of harmony in our troubled world lies in the plurality of our identities, which cut across each other and work against sharp divisions around one single hardened line of vehement division that allegedly cannot be resisted. And so our shared humanity gets challenged when our differences are narrowed into one device system of uniquely powerful categorization. So I think, and he also refers to reductionism in other parts of the book. So this way of thinking of reducing our identities into singular categorization has not been helpful. And I think the British as well, in its efforts of categorizing ethnicities according to different In fact, they wanted to generalize the categories a lot more rather than celebrate the differences, where I think like, you know, even Bugis or Minangkabau were eventually like consolidated into much larger categories as opposed to smaller categories. So I believe that moving forward, we should celebrate when political parties move away from race. I do think that that's a positive move. And over the last 10 years, I would say that this started happening probably more so in 2008, when there was increasing electoral and political competition between the parties. I think beginning from 2008, there have been attempts to do that. And I think Malaysia is actually currently at that point of a crossroads. And I've said this for a long time, right? But this crossroads seems to have lasted for more than a decade even, where you've had to choose between moving away from a race-based political party system towards a non-race-based system, and we seem to still be stuck in between. And I think we're not quite sure where to move. You see some of the new parties like trying to move away from it, but yet being pulled back, and you see that in the form of the newer parties, Parti Bersatu, and even in Parti Pejuang. So I am not saying that we should reduce ultimately the importance of our individual racial, religious, or cultural origins. Not at all. I think we should be proud of our origins, and we should celebrate those. We should celebrate the fact that we are uniquely different, Malay, Chinese, and Indian. In fact, I am saying that there should be a celebration of much more multiplicities of identities as opposed to less. Of course, the problem comes about when there is when the recognition or the celebration of one of these would place an imposition on those of the others, and that's where the problem lies. So I would like to question actually, like, can we identify ourselves along other lines so that one identity does not in fact dominate, but is merely one of a multiplicity of identity markers? My conclusion is that in answering the question of whether oneness of identity is a necessity in nation building, I answered it at the very beginning by saying no. In fact, the more multiple identities we have, the better. I also strongly disagree that the state should enforce a solid one identity for people who are actually wonderfully different. And we may have a common goal for a shared nation, but this does not mean that we need to have a hard, singular, unified identity. So that's actually the conclusion of what I had prepared. But I also want to refer to the Constitution because some of you mentioned it, and also Article 153 has come up in the last speaker's session. So I think we should address the elephant in the room, which is that Article 153 does differentiate between, on the one hand, the Malays and natives of the states of Sabah and Sarawak and other communities. So the article does address both of these communities, but it uses different phrases to address these two communities. On the one hand, the article says that, yes, the Agong's responsibility is to safeguard what is called the special position of Malays and natives in the states of Sabah and Sarawak, and also the legitimate interests of other communities, right? I do believe that anyone who's actually, interested in talking about nation building, we need to unpack that. We need to address that. What does it actually mean when we say special position versus legitimate interest? I mean, evidently, the drafters of the Constitution had something in mind when they categorized this group into two different versions of these, right? And I think that's actually a problem because and it is such an arbitrarily determined definition of these two terms. And who is it to determine the definition of what special position means versus legitimate interest? And I don't think, in recent modern discussions, at least of equality and of the Bumiputra position, the definition of these two terms have actually been duly defined and unpacked and addressed and deconstructed sufficiently. Actually, within the article itself, in subsection 2, it does talk about the kinds of things that the special position would receive, and it's actually spelled out quite clearly. And I would quote that now in Article 153, subsection 2, that this would include positions in the public service other than public service of the state, scholarships, exhibitions, education and training privileges, and special facilities given or accorded by the federal government, and any permits or license for the operation of trade and business when they are required by federal law. So the Constitution does actually go quite explicitly into what kinds of things the special position of the Malays and the natives of Sabah and Sarawak could receive by virtue of the Agong deeming reasonable. And in fact, if one could pursue further, then the question would be, does it mean then that anything beyond the very nicely carved out mandate that's being put into the Article 153, anything beyond this should therefore not be given a special position? So I think these are things that must be tackled. Ultimately, yes, we do believe in all the things that the Rukun Negara is saying, and I like the general tone of what the other speakers are talking about as well, multiculturalism and of course upholding Rukun Negara. But I do think that it is important to address the sort of differentiation of treatment. Maybe treatment is not the right word, but the differentiation of the language that is being used in the Constitution, what special position versus legitimate interest actually mean. And I suppose back to my point, concluding again, my session of the talk, essentially I would like to celebrate a multiplicity of identity rather than having hard, singular, unified identities. Thank you very much, and I think I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Tricia. You've brought up some very interesting and pertinent issues there. Right, the last bit here is the concluding remarks, which I'm supposed to make, but I think it is impossible for me to summarize all the information and the perceptions and the interpretations that each one of the esteemed speakers have put forth. So I shan't be too smart in summarizing your views. I shall in fact ask you in a minute to summarize your own stance or stand. Now, what I wish to say here is that a lot of the deliberations and the thinking is in fact inspired by, documents, original, laws and the Constitution and Rukun Negara, which are regarded as sacrosanct. But I think we must remember that these, they're not documents. So what do you call them? These are important, binding, philosophies and perspectives and precepts were actually articulated by ordinary people, all right? Of course, many of them were experts in their own field, but with language, language is like a constantly changing factor. It's meanings change, implications change, and so on, because our context is forever evolving. So even words like unity, I keep saying this, unity will remain an absolute, just as justice and the other one is justice, equality, they are absolutes, that we aspire to. But it seems as though, anything else that falls short of the 100% mark is considered as disunity, and that the country is in a state of flux. All right, that the ranjau sepanjang jalan, that Malaysia is facing in its nation building efforts is littered with thorns all the way. Now, I'm more of an optimist. I think, as Sharifa Mastura said in her talk, these are normal things, we deliberate, we discuss, we even disagree. That's okay, all right? We have multiple identities. Yes, Tricia, we have multiple identities and we're proud of each one of our identities. But when people try to put us in a box, that's when we revolt. We don't like to be stereotyped. We don't like to be, characterized as something because we are of from one community. So this is the kind of thing that I think Farid meant when he said that multiculturalism is an attitude. Yeah, we must be compassionate and tolerant, and don't like the word tolerant, accommodating, understanding of other people's needs. Only then can the road, along the way, can the path be smoother. It will never be smooth, 100% smooth. There will always be altercations and so on, and that we must accept as part of nation building. I don't know whether any other country, nation, talks of unity as much as we do, because I think, UK and US, unity is not within their reach, but they don't talk about it in terms of national unity, right? So that's a thought to ponder about. Right, your last words, Dr. Chandra, a nice summary of what we have been on about for the last 2 hours.
Thank you. This is in line with what you have just said and what many others have said. We have to see integration as a journey, not a destination. Of course, there will be challenges. We must be prepared for them. What is important, I think, in this journey is to ensure that there is no violence, because this is the sort of journey, a journey related to integration, that can very often lead to violence. We have to ensure that there's no violence. Our level of understanding of one another will increase as we go along, and we would at some point show greater empathy for one another than we have shown in the past. That, I think, should be our goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chandra. Professor Wazir, your last words, Wazir?
Yeah. I just like to say that I hope the audience has not been confused by the number of terms introduced this afternoon. We move from multiracial to multicultural to plural to multiple identities to liberal to progressive. And I think this might be confusing for the average nation to understand that we're trying to grapple with a very complex society where people still want to express differences, but in a way which they're comfortable with, through language, through origin, through history. But what is very important for Malaysians to understand is that a lot of these kind of sentiments might lead to a kind of national anarchy, which we might want to avoid, which we should avoid. What has happened in countries like United States, for example, when a small minority sentiment of supremacists, was hijacked or introduced into a national type identity, like an ultra-right identity, became the choice identity of the average Caucasian American. And this is something we really have to avoid in Malaysia. We don't want a kind of supremacist identity to be hijacked into a national identity, a national type which might be introduced into political parties. And this, I think, is what we should avoid. So to talk about multiple identities, I think, is not very difficult, because all of us know we do have these multiple identities. We just have to know how to journey our way out of the scope of sentiment of wanting to recognize our belonging as the ultimate belonging in Malaysia. Like, who are the original people of Malaysia? Who came to Malaysia first? Who introduced this type of food first? All this kind of things, this kind of dialogue, which is now so rampant in Malaysia. Who were the first people who went to the Merbok Valley? I mean, the inability of Malays to recognize that they were once Hindu, for example, is a big problem in itself already to understand who, how all these people come together in a multiple society like us. And I think we got to be very careful here, like to use, as an anthropologist, for example, to use a word like multiracial. We don't even use that because race means to recognize ourselves as different from another group in terms of color, origin, history. And that will bring out deep into our DNA structures, and we don't want to do that. So we just have to, I think, understand that we are in a life-changing crisis now, where Malaysians are aware that they're moving into very dangerous waters and that the average Malaysian wants to get out of it. So we have to do this with the cooperation of our national leaders, our political leaders, and with our community leaders itself, and see how we can path our way out of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Wazir. Professor Farid, your last words. Switch on. You've got to switch on your video, your audio.
Okay, sorry about that. I just want to say something about the Rukun Negara in my last words. The second principle says loyalty to king and country. In Malay, it says kesetiaan kepada raja dan negara. I think that's probably, the reason why my father wanted negara to be stated, translated, or other country to be translated as bangsa, negara, rather than use negara, use bangsa, because the question of loyalty of Malaysians is not to the state, it's to the country, it's to the nation, and not to a specific ethnic group, but rather to the whole nation, what we would like to think of as Bangsa Malaysia. Now, educating Malaysians about the Rukun Negara and upholding its spirit will not change the hearts of politicians and other elite who put selfish interests above the country's well-being. But at least the stress on the Rukun Negara, more education about it may instill a greater sense of optimism, a greater sense of hope, and a greater sense of patriotism, and ultimately a stronger national sentiment, a stronger national consciousness among the people who should continue to press our leaders to do the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Farid. Judge David, your last words.
In the course of my preparation of my talk on the Rukun Negara, I find that it is actually a very well thought out and deep document. And the only way in this flawed world of ours for people to know the law is for the law to be enforced. And in spite of our diversity, we can still have unity, we can still have dialogue, provided it's all within the four corners of the law. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge David. And now, last but not least, Tricia, your last.
Thank you. I feel slightly pressured to represent the views of my demographic, not saying anything about the other speakers, of course, and not to denigrate the rest. I think that I was probably one of the last among Malaysians who have experienced what I refer to as the Malaysian experience. When I refer to that, I mean that, schools that are really multiracial, friends and communities, neighbors that are truly multiracial. After my generation and the people who are now in their 20s and 30s, unfortunately do not have the same, what I call Malaysian experience as the rest of us may have had. And so the romanticization that we've had of this nation I think is also being lost. I don't have the solution to that, and I do believe that restoring a belief in the Constitution and the belief in the Rukun Negara are definitely ways to do that, as well as appreciation of history are ways to do that. But I do think that much more needs to be done in I mean, I don't even know whether reviving the Malaysian experience is something that is worth doing, because I think we need to redefine, or the younger people need to redefine what it means to have a Malaysian experience, because I can tell you that that's not the same today. There are more Malays studying in Chinese schools than there are Chinese studying in national schools today, and that is statistically correct. So the work that we're trying to do at Ideas, I mean, of course, we try to do data-driven work, but I think the drive for nation building needs to also be commensurate with the current reality of whatever the Malaysian experience is today. And I'll just end there in the hopes that we can do more to redefine whatever this new narrative needs to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Trisha. Prabha, would you like to have some last words and say the final thank you?
Thank you, all of you, for joining in this conversation. It has been a wonderful conversation, and we hope that we'll take off from here and organize a few more in the series. Thank you very much for your participation.
And thank you, Gerakbudaya, Nadine, for your very fine management of this webinar. Thank you all. Bye.